Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Regulating Deepfakes, an overview of policy initiatives. My name is Frederic Heymans. This is an initiative of the Knowledge Center Data and Society's Policy Monitor. The Policy Monitor analyzes recent policy documents related to AI and data applications. And in that context, we also organize webinars, of which this webinar is a part. Let me briefly guide you through the program of today. So first, Lucas Desard of ML6 will give us an introduction to deepfake technology and its potential. Then I will discuss a few threats and general challenges of deepfakes, and this is followed by an exploration of global policy initiatives by Thomas and myself. Questions for this webinar can be submitted via the chat. And I would also like to announce that this event will also be recorded and published later on the website of the Knowledge Center. So let's start, and I will now give the floor to Lucas.
Thanks, Frederic. I'll start sharing my screen. All right, so hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on regulating deepfakes. This intro on deepfakes will only take 15 minutes, so let's jump right into it. I'll start off by telling a little bit more about myself. So my name is Lucas Desard. I graduated as a computer scientist from the KU Leuven, and I'm working as a machine learning engineer at ML6 ever since. ML6 is a consultancy company that specializes in everything machine learning, and in my job I spend about 80% of my time working on client projects, and the other 20% of time and in my spare time I'm putting my shoulders to the wheel of Generate. It's like this special separate brand within ML6 where I focus on business opportunities for generative AI, and deepfakes are also a large part of this. So let's get on to the main topic of today, which is a personal favorite, deepfakes. I'll start off by explaining what they are, then I'll go over the process of how to make one yourself. Then I'll talk a little bit about the different use cases that we're seeing in the world, and to end off with a discussion on deepfake detection. So what are deepfakes? The first deepfake ever appeared in 2017 on Reddit. The word says itself, it's in two parts: deep from deep learning, which is a subfield of machine learning concerned with the use of neural networks, and fake from not real. And this brings us to like the official definition, which is a realistic looking digitally manipulated photo or video through use of deep learning of a person in which they appear to be someone else or say something else. They are most infamous for being used in some kind of malicious way, like spreading of misinformation or the making of unsolicited adult videos. However, not all use cases are malicious. So yeah, they come in a variety of flavors and application. However, the most popular one by far is the face swap technique. And this is also the one which we'll be focusing on today. With this technique, you can swap the face of your source subject onto your target subject. And yeah, in this example, the source is my face and the target is a colleague of mine, Jan. And as a result, you get this funky looking merged face. Maybe it looks quite normal to you guys, but yeah, I can tell you for me, it's quite weird seeing myself like that. And the field of deep learning is rapidly evolving. This is no different for deepfakes, as you can see on this slide. Since their inception about 5 years ago, deepfakes have been increasingly getting higher resolution and more realistic over the years, now having arrived at a point where they are able to fool you in high resolution. And if you're not convinced by that, you can just type into Google deep Tom Cruise or any other popular deepfake, and you'll come to the same conclusion. Okay, so what if you want to make a deepfake yourself? What tools should you use? Yeah, there exist various easy to use and fast apps such as Reface, but there are also more advanced tools that give you the ability to generate broadcast quality deepfakes. And for this, you'll need still a good amount of time and resources. So what are the ingredients you need? So first you need a destination video. So this is the video that contains the person that you want to deepfake, and a face set or source video, which contains the source face for your deepfake. In the ideal case, if you want to make your deepfake as realistic as possible, it's typically someone of the same ethnicity, age, and gender. Next to that, you'll also need a lot of computing power and patience. Maybe some more details on what a good face set is. Well, a good face set consists of about 3,000 to 10,000 pictures of the source face, containing a lot of different camera angles, facial expressions, eye movements, lip movements. The basic idea is that you want to give a data set to the face mapping model so that it can learn how the source face looks in every possible angle and way. The most important thing here is that at least most of the camera angles and lighting conditions that are present in the target video are also covered in the face set. So now that we've got all the ingredients, let's get cooking. The first step is really basic. So you just extract all the frames of both videos, and then you get 2 folders containing all the frames. The second step is to do face and landmark detection. So basically, for each picture, you're going to detect the faces in the picture and crop out each individual face which looks like this. And then for each cropped face, you're going to use a machine learning model to also detect the landmarks. And the landmarks are basically telling the deepfake model where are the eyes, where is the nose, where is the mouth, how are they positioned. For example, is the person smiling, etc. This might come in handy in one of the next steps. So then comes the segmentation step. This is used to tell the deepfake algorithm what part of the image is the face and what part is background. So the algorithm knows where the focus it's learning. For this, you'll have to manually label like 20 to 30 frames of each video and then train a segmentation model. In some of the frames, there are, if in some of the frames there are objects before the face, such as, for example, a hand partly covering the face, then you'll have to label around the hand so that the deepfake models knows not to include this in its process. And then, the training of the face segmentation model looks a little bit like this. And basically, it's learning for all the frames where the face is located. And then, it's possible that you might have to do a second round of labeling if for some parts of the face it missed some parts. After that, we can start the real magic, and that's start training the actual face mapping model, where the model learns to map the face of the source person onto the target person. So here you can see the algorithm learning gradually over time. You can see that over time the algorithm learns the fine details of a face and gradually produces a higher quality result. This is the most resource intensive part also. For this you need a computer with a powerful GPU and a few days of time to train it. And this can be quite complex. And then the final step is to apply the trained deepfake model to the frames of the target video and then just merge the results. There are plenty of tricks to make it look even more realistic. You can spend a lot of time in an effort on post-production of the video, where you adjust some of the settings to use the right color transfer and to maybe clean some of the edges of the deepfake mask on the video. All right, so now that you all know how to make deepfake, what can we do with them? So according to a report from Sensity.ai, a company that specializes in deepfake detection, the amount of deepfakes circulating on the internet doubled roughly every 6 months between 2018 and 2020, and they are only getting more popular. We don't have any recent data though. And deepfakes are most known for their infamous applications. So let's start with the ugly part, I guess. According to the same report of Sensity.ai, roughly 96% of all deepfakes that they identified online were pornographic in nature. Often used to make adult videos of celebrities. We have to keep in mind that it's very hard to actually estimate this number, but even if it's only 90 or 80%, that's just a crazy high amount of the deepfakes, a fact that we really can't be proud of as humanity. Another negative use case is the spreading of misinformation. For example, 2 years ago, Extinction Rebellion made this deepfake video of Sophie Wilmès as with as title "The Truth About COVID-19 and the Ecological Crisis." Although the video was mainly used to raise awareness for climate change, I don't think I have to elaborate on the fact that this can become very dangerous very quickly. And for this, it will be important that we develop a good deepfake detection algorithms, although this is easier said than done, as I'll elaborate also at the end of this presentation. Another type of deepfake that has recently been gaining in popularity is voice cloning. So this is basically where a model learns the voice characteristics of a person, which in turn can then be used to imitate them and defraud people. There have already been multiple reports on this, and that it was used to commit fraud, with one case even resulting in the loss of $35 million after a company's director, his voice was cloned. Luckily, there are also some positive use cases, and with positive, I don't really mean that we're going to save the world with them, but more that they can be used for entertainment purposes. First one is maybe the most obvious one, which is parody. In the early days, a lot of deepfakes were Nicolas Cage being deepfaked in literally every movie out there. In a similar fashion, it can also be used to enhance impersonation attempts, or maybe also used to make new footage of people that are already dead, such as you can see from DALL-E here in the bottom left corner. Another cool application is to use it as an anonymization technique in sensitive documentaries, where the witness that wants to give a testimony needs to stay anonymous. Typically, they use techniques such as blurring or filming in silhouette, or letting the subject wear a real mask. However, this reduces the emotional impact of your story, because viewers cannot see the person in question, and then makes it less trustworthy. This can be solved by using deepfakes, since the witness will not be recognizable anymore, but the facial expressions and the emotions will be kept intact. It's also great news for dub movies. I personally cannot watch a video where the lip movements don't correspond to the actual audio. This is something in the future that can be solved with deepfakes. You can make a person say anything you want, and so you can also change the language itself. This could also save a lot of costs in advertising companies that make, for example, ads for multinationals. You only have to shoot a single video, and then after the fact, you could swap out the language to the target country that you want to use it for. This example of David Beckham is a good one. Here he makes an ad campaign for Malaria Must Die, and in the promotional video they use deepfakes to translate the video into 9 other languages that he never spoke. And then another interesting idea I just discovered while doing research is to add realism to video games. So on the right, you can see I applied a deepfake to the game Assassin's Creed. And there has been so much research on bridging the gap of the uncanny valley already. I think this might be an interesting next direction. It can also be used to create new content of the younger version of an actor. In movies, for example, you often have a scene that's a throwback to the same person, but a couple of years ago. Deepfakes could help make those scenes more realistic and let the viewer buy into it. And this can also replace expensive and difficult post-production methods that are currently used. And the last use case are just some fun applications. For example, at ML6 we made a deepfake photo booth where you can swap yourself into any painting of your choosing, which is kind of a nice application, I think. All right, finally, what about deepfake detection? What is sure is that it will forever be a cat and mouse game where advancements in deepfakes will lead to advancements in detecting them. But to be honest, I'm not that optimistic about the detection side. Why? Well, It's because you can put an enormous amount of computation in generating a single deepfake video. But however, for platforms such as Facebook or YouTube or other social media platforms, they can only put a very limited amount of compute resources into detecting these deepfakes because there's so much content being uploaded. For example, YouTube alone, there's 500 hours of video material uploaded every minute. So it's impossible to dedicate a lot of resources into detecting them, while you can I put an endless amount of computation in the creation of a single video. Some material to support this conclusion is that in 2019, you had like the big tech companies, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, they all launched a deepfake detection competition with a $1 million prize for first place. And like of the top 10 submissions, all the submissions just cut up the video in individual frames and then try to apply like an image classification network on these individual images. That's just not gonna cut it. I also tried out one myself. The results you can see here on the right. Where I applied explainable AI to show the area where the deep learning model focuses on to make the prediction. Here you can see it predicts the mask a little bit. However, it's a cherry-picked best example I could find. For most of the frames, it didn't detect anything at all, and to be honest, it's not that useful at this point. Please keep in mind, this is a personal opinion. I might be wrong about this. Let's pray that I am. There are certainly a handful of companies that have sprung up in the past 2 years that claim that they can provide deepfake detection services, but it's something that's very easy to claim, and I haven't seen any proof as of yet, so I have to remain skeptical for the time being. With that, I'd like to close off the introduction to deepfakes. And maybe if there are some questions, I'm open to answering them. And otherwise, I give the word back to Frederic.
Thank you, Lucas, for this very interesting presentation. There was one question already in the chat, but this will be discussed later in the presentation by Thomas. So I'll continue now. Yes. Lucas just described some, in his presentation, some general threats of deepfakes. We'll go a bit more into detail now. There are many actors pointing out the potential dangers of deepfakes for criminal purposes. Europol and Unicry, UN research institutes, recently published a report on the malicious use of artificial intelligence with an extensive chapter devoted to deepfakes. The text describes a whole range of scenarios. We go over the most notable ones here. The use of deepfakes, especially on a large scale for criminal purposes, has so far been a limited phenomenon, but the danger lies in the increasing accessibility and the quality of tools to create deepfakes. First example was also mentioned by Lucas, are disinformation campaigns. The best known examples of deepfakes are those involving politicians. Those deepfakes did not have too serious consequences, but if the technology is deployed in a smart way, it could have consequences at different scales. It could, for example, have consequences for democracy. Currently, there is a big problem with fake news and disinformation. Deepfakes could give that problem a new dimension. It can also lead to social unrest and political polarization. It can be used to interfere with elections, and they can even lead to international conflicts. Second threat that we discuss here is, and that is also mentioned by Europol, is securities fraud. Deepfakes could be instrumentalized for facilitating document fraud. For example, cases have already surfaced in the insurance sector, but it can also create large-scale problems such as stock market manipulation, disruption of financial markets. For example, the report gives fictitious examples, such as the deepfake of a senior company official deceiving company employees. to facilitate theft of trade secrets or sensitive company data. And also in the cryptocurrency sector, there have also been a number of incidents of deepfakes for the purpose of scams. For example, a fake hologram was recently created of the spokesperson of Binance, the world's largest cryptocurrency platform. Third threat is extortion. By threatening to release a fake video that would damage the reputation or credibility of an individual or legal entity, criminals could also use deepfakes to extort or ransom or privileged information. Fourth scenario that was identified by Europol and Unicry was online crimes against children. Deepfake technology could be used to create fake identity for the purposes of child grooming or to convert the face of an adult to that of a child or a minor, thus raising concerns about entirely new challenges to preventing the sexual exploitation of children. And additionally, deepfakes might be used by criminals to facilitate the online sexual coercion and the extortion, generating sexually explicit material that depicts the victim or other children. The last two scenarios are obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice that's falsifying or manipulating electronic evidence for creating disorder in criminal justice investigation and judicial proceedings. And the last one is illicit markets. This is the proliferation of deepfake development toolkits and services for malicious purposes. They could become an emerging profitable underground market. So deepfake creation services are already offered in various underground markets and online forums. This is a phenomenon that economic policymakers and regulators will soon have to start taking into account. Then we go to general challenges. So the threats that I just ran through, they are numerous. This confronts policymakers and society as a whole, in general, with a number of challenges that we will look at now. First topic is deepfake detection. Lucas already spoke about this in this presentation, so I will skip this for now. Maybe one remark that I'll make. So there's technological complexity, there's a technological arms race, but also there's a role in this for the private sector and social media companies in general. Currently, at the moment, the incentives to encourage these companies to take more action are lacking. So that is an issue that needs to be solved. Second general challenge here is content authentication. There is a need for better mechanisms to validate authentic content. The use of digital provenance techniques, including blockchain approaches and digital watermarking of potential source photos. They either require sweeping and expensive changes to the existing body of available source images on the internet. So that's a problem. And there's also a need for a notable cooperative effort among nations and governments to create systems of invigilation and authentication. Then a broad topic is our complex legal questions. Both for authorities and internet intermediaries, there are a number of complex legal questions to deal with. The first one is the rights of expression and the fundamental human rights and a prerequisite for democracy. It has a broad scope of protection, which includes expressions of opinions that are disturbing, hurtful, or may be perceived as shocking if they contribute to the public debate. And although deliberate production and dissemination of this information is circumscribed by expressions prohibited by law, such as, for example, defamation, hate speech, or calls for violence, it is not prohibited as such by definition. So deepfake therefore, in principle, enjoy protection under freedom of expression, regardless of whether there is deliberate and deceptive falsification. When determining the level of protection, the content of communication and any fundamental rights clashes should be taken into account. The US, for example, has a very broad definition of free speech and imposes only limited restrictions. So the First Amendment, therefore, does not make it easy to regulate deepfakes. A second issue is the conflicting interests of citizens. So often citizens have different interests at stake in the context of deepfakes. So the choice to grant one person's request simultaneously involves the choice to restrict the rights of or interest of another. And in the context of deepfakes, it is difficult to assess these conflicting interests. The last one is if measures are taken against deepfakes, to what extent is society prepared to restrict the free flow of information? And also there is multiple involved jurisdictions. So which legal regime applies to the publication of a deepfake when multiple jurisdictions may play a role? So for example, if a data controller is located in Europe, a data subject is located in China, and a website is based in the US, how do you deal with conflicting rules and requirements? That is a very complicated issue. So these legal issues, they are discussed in detail in a report by the Tilburg University of the Netherlands, which Thomas will discuss in more detail in a moment. Last two general challenges are deepfake policies. And this ties in with the legal questions. So policymakers, they face a difficult task. They have to find a balance between restrictions on the one hand and the possibility of developing promising technology with the potential economic benefits on the other hand. Second thing is the new policy and legislation measures. They also have to be designed in such a way that they can last for a longer period and that they can survive consecutive ways of innovation. Fitting new regulations into an existing legislative framework can be quite a puzzle, requiring a lot of research. There's fragmentation of policies. Fragmentation can, for example, in Europe, where national initiatives will have to be coordinated with actions on the European level, they can be an issue. There's the same issue in the US, where you have state level policy initiatives, but also initiatives on the federal level. And the last issue here is enhanced efforts to raise awareness on deepfakes and their associated threats will be crucial for empowering the public, different industries, and competent authorities. Enforcement is the last general challenge. So there is already existing legislation and new regulations may be drafted, but those rules must then also be enforced. Law enforcement authorities, such as the public prosecutor and the data protection authorities, they are already overburdened at the moment in many countries. And they often focus on data processing operations by government organizations and by commercial parties, and not on data processing by citizens. Next to that, there's also a difficulty in finding the producer of deepfake videos, and ultimately even with enforcement, the video may remain online without additional measures to require its removal from distribution platforms. Platforms also risk enforcement risks. Deepfakes pose liability and reputation challenges, but moderation adjustments are also needed on a practical level. And lastly, claims as to the use of deepfake material will require further law enforcement assessments, leading to new cases and new types of work. This will result in an increased workload and a push for law enforcement officers to develop new skills. So that was the last challenge. I'll now give the floor to Thomas, who will go over a couple global policy initiatives.
Indeed. Hello, everyone. In this next part, I will address first some studies and reports before diving into more concrete legislative proposals. A first interesting study was published by the European Parliament. And that study, named the study on how to tackle deepfakes in European policy, started by mapping the regulatory landscape of deepfakes. And according to the study, this constitutes a complex web of norms, which entails both hard and soft law, both at the EU and the member state level. And it listed quite a bit of possible relevant policy and regulatory frameworks. Think about the AI Act, the GDPR, the EU copyright regime, the e-commerce directive, the Digital Services Act, the Code of Practice on Disinformation, and the Action Plan on Disinformation. And now, according to the study, the current rules and regulation do offer some kind of a guidance for mitigating potential negative impacts of deepfakes. But the problem, on the other hand, is that the legal remedies for victims of malicious deepfakes remain very challenging, because various actors are often involved in the life cycle of a deepfake, and more often than not, these actors act anonymously, which makes it very hard for victims to actually hold them accountable. Moreover, victims may also lack the appropriate resources needed for starting a judicial procedure, leaving them vulnerable. And therefore, the study finds that that platforms and technology providers could play a vital role in helping victims to identify malicious actors. But then, for instance, technology providers, they could have a responsibility to safeguarding the positive and legal use of their technology. Hence, the overall conclusion of the report is that policymakers should take different dimensions of the deepfake life cycle into account when you're aiming to mitigate the potential negative impacts. And in that regard, the report introduces 5 dimensions of policy options. Per dimension, the report contains various policy options, and so just to illustrate, we will highlight one per each dimension. First dimension highlighted by the report is the technology dimension, which addresses the technology underlying deepfakes and the actors involved in producing and providing said technology. And in this regard, it, for instance, rightfully recommends to classify deepfake technology as high-risk AI systems under the AI Act, meaning that the respective obligations on high-risk AI systems would also apply to deepfake technology. The next dimension is the creation dimension, and this targets the creators of deepfakes, or under the AI Act, the users of an AI system. Here again, additional measures under the AI Act are mentioned. For instance, the clarification of guidelines for the manner of labeling deepfakes, while also restricting the exceptions to such labeling requirement, and potentially also the banning of certain deepfake applications altogether. This is followed by the circulation dimension, which addresses the dissemination of deepfakes. And this is a very important dimension, obviously, because the circulation of a deepfake determines to a large extent the scale and the severity of its impact. And so in this regard, online platforms, media and communication services have to take up some kind of role. And therefore, the study suggests to introduce, for instance, an obligation on platforms, but also other intermediaries, to have deepfake detection software, which could may be a result of the Digital Services Act, but that has to be ascertained once the final text of the DSA is actually published. The fourth dimension is the target dimension. This revolves around improving the protection of the victims of deepfakes, including institutionalizing support for victims of deepfakes. And so in that regard, the study argues that their rights are often protected by law, but that it remains quite difficult for them to actually enforce them. And in that regard, the study suggests to, for instance, strengthen the capacity of DPAs, data protection authorities, to respond to the use of personal data for deepfakes. And then finally, there is the audience dimension, because often deepfakes will transcend the individual level and have an impact on group or even societal level. And so also there, measures need to be taken. And in that context, it is suggested to increase investment in media literacy and technological citizenship. Should you be interested in the entire overview of policy options, we highly recommend you to actually go and consult the study on our website, because at the end of the study, there's a usual overview table with all those policy options. Similarly, in the Netherlands, the Dutch Scientific Research and Documentation Center published another interesting report. And the main question of that study was whether the current legal framework is capable of adequately tackling the negative effects of deepfake technology, and if not, what could be possible options for modifying the legal framework. Now, this research focused primarily on citizens as recipients and users of deepfake messages, and only incidentally addresses the use of these techniques by corporations, companies, or other large organizations. Again, this is quite an extensive study, and it revolves around the main finding that the legal framework applicable to deepfakes is not the primary problem, but that the detection and enforcement of existing and future legal rules is. And in that regard, for instance, refers to the fact that committing fraud and deception by means of a deepfake is currently already punishable, just as the introduction of false evidence in a court is, but that the actual problem is then detecting such deepfake evidence in a court proceeding and enforcing the existing respective rules. Nonetheless, the report still provides a range of regulatory options in three areas: substantive law, procedural law, and enforcement and oversight. And so for the purpose of this presentation, let's highlight two. One interesting proposal put forward by the report is actually to prohibit the production, the distribution, possession, or use of deepfake technology for the consumer market altogether. Because current legislative provisions do not restrict the development of deepfake technology and the marketing of such technology unless it is used for specific, especially criminal purposes. And the background to that quite far-reaching proposal is the report's striking finding that apparently more than 95% of the deepfakes currently published or disseminated between citizens are potentially punishable. Another pertinent proposal relates to procedural law, and there it is suggested to develop rules or policies regarding the use of deepfake evidence in court, because as you can imagine, the use of possible deepfake videos can have a significant impact on, for instance, criminal evidence gathering and review. Now, if we then go towards a more concrete action plan, we can take a look at Austria, because they quite recently published an action plan to fight deepfakes. And also how to tackle related societal challenges, more specifically disinformation and hate speech. And this plan pays a particular attention to the threats to Austrian and European society in the field of security policy, law, and technology. Moreover, it also mentions three specific goals. First of all, raising awareness among the population and strengthening the population's ability to verify digital content, but also the increased protection of the constitutional institutions and the critical infrastructure of Austria. It then has 4 fields of action, and in those respective fields, it suggests several potential measures. With regards to structures and processes, it, for instance, suggests to establish a focus group on the topic of disinformation in which a variety of stakeholders should participate, which should be further complemented by strategic actions with regard to the protection of democracy, the individual, think about personal data protection, but also national security and technological developments. This should then this should be reported on annually in a report to the Austrian Parliament. And then finally, it is also suggested to take additional precautions at government level. Think about raising public officials' awareness of deepfake technology, but also the establishment of working groups related to hybrid threats, so threats with both civilian as a military aspect. With regard to government, it's quite interesting to see that they explicitly suggest to define the various roles, responsibilities, and competences of both state and non-state actors, and that those roles and responsibilities should then be formalized in a framework for cooperation between all those stakeholders, whereby it is said that this should especially include the need for increased cooperation and also more obligations on online platforms, both at the national Austrian level as well as at the European level. And also here they intend to increase measures with regard to raising awareness among the Austrian but also European population about deepfakes and their potential impacts. With regard to research and development, it's quite interesting to see that the Austrian government explicitly says that the combat of deepfakes should remain a central research focus of national and EU security research programs, but also that stakeholders should jointly develop the conceptual foundations and technological tools that should enable the rapid detection of threats from deepfakes. Finally, they also intend to further expand the current Austrian work being done on combating deepfakes, because there is already a project going on in Austria called Defalsify, which is working on the identification of false information, so a bit broader than deepfakes, by use of AI. Now, if we turn towards concrete legislative proposals, a first interesting proposal can actually be a Chinese legislative proposal, because at the beginning of 2022, the Chinese Cyberspace Administration introduced a draft law on the management of deep synthesis internet information services, and the overall aim of that regulation is to regulate activities that use deep synthesis technology to provide internet information services, as well as activities that provide technical support to such deep synthesis services. And so hence organizations that engage in such activities, on the one hand, deep synthesis services or the related support, they are the most important addressees of this law and fall under that notion of deep synthesis service provider, the DSSPs. Moreover, it's also important to understand that the draft covers deep synthesis technology, which is defined quite broadly and refers to the use of technologies using generative sequencing algorithms to make text, images, audio, video, virtual scenes, or other information. Additionally, the proposal also specifically mentions 6 sectors, or let's say fields of application, in which DST can be used, and refers, for instance, to the generation of text content, voice content, or non-voice audio content. And by some, it is believed that the order of those sectors, so first text content, then voice content, non-voice content, and then also later video content, so that order of sectors function as an indication of which domains China actually considers to be most crucial, meaning that China believes that text-based AI-generated fake news may have a more severe impact than voice synthesis, which on its turn is put ahead of video deepfakes in terms of its potential impact. Quite an interesting thought. Now, more detailedly speaking, the proposal, on the one hand, proposes a few general principles and also a few specific principles. A general principle includes, for instance, the obligation to promote the advancement and improvement of deep synthesis services in a way that respects Chinese laws and regulations, which includes adherence to the correct political direction. Moreover, deep synthesis technology must also not be used to engage in activities that are prohibited under Chinese law, for instance, subverting state authority or endangering national security. And finally, attention is also given to the infringement of legitimate rights and interests of others. Think about image, privacy, or intellectual property rights, as well as the prohibition to use deepfakes for pornography. And so already on the basis of those general principles, it can be understood that deepfake technology actually becomes quite restricted to be used in China. Now, the proposal then lists quite a variety of specific obligations, and we'll highlight just a few of them. So a first specific obligation on DSSPs is the obligation to add marks to their deep synthesis information content for the purpose of both identifying deep synthesis information as such, as well as to allow for the tracing of such content. And this is complemented by an indicative list of domains in which marking is considered to be utterly necessary, where again, a primary focus is put on text-based AI-generated fake news, for instance, and on audio deepfakes. Moreover, service providers, if they discover that deepfake content was not adequately labeled as such, then they should immediately stop the transmission of that content, label it and unlabel it before resuming transmission. Another specific obligation is the obligation to obtain consent of a person whose biometric data is used for a deepfake, unless exceptions apply. This would also be the case under, for instance, the EU GDPR. And then finally, there are a host of other notable obligations. For instance, DSSPs, they need to conduct reviews of the data input by users of their deep synthesis services, as well as the synthesis results, so a kind of moderation obligation. They should also establish a database of characteristics that they use to identify illegal and negative deep synthesis content. Moreover, users of deep synthesis services, they have to undergo a real name identity verification. And if not, DSSPs cannot provide such users, if they do not pass that identity verification, they cannot offer those users their publishing or platform services. And finally, and this is again quite a far-reaching obligation, DSSPs, they have to register their pertinent applications with the state, so that the state is aware of possible deep synthesis technology applications. And this then is also complemented by an obligation on app stores to actually monitor the supply of deep synthesis services in their stores. And if they, so the app stores themselves, find that those services violate the requirements of this law, of this draft proposal, then they must take them off the market and have to suspend the availability. So what is striking about this proposal is that this law specifically targets, or predominantly targets, platforms and service providers, whereas other initiatives typically also put the emphasis on creators themselves. So this is quite an interesting view that comes from China. But secondly, together with the new proposed law on the algorithmic recommendations in China, of which you can also find a summary on our site, we see really that alongside the whole digital value chain, increasing pressure is being put on all kinds of service providers, including also industry organizations or developers. If we then take a look at the AI Act, we also see that the AI Act includes a specific article with regard to deepfakes, namely Article 52, paragraph 3. And this article contains a transparency obligation and mandates that users of an AI system that generates or manipulates image, audio, or video content that appreciably resembles existing persons, objects, places, or other entities or events, and whereby such content falsely appears to be a person, to a person to be authentic or truthful, then the users have to disclose the fact that such content is of an artificial nature. However, there are two important exceptions to that transparency obligation. First, if such deepfake content, let's say, is authorized to be used by law to detect or prevent and investigate criminal offenses. And secondly, if the use of such deepfake content would be necessary for the exercise of the freedom of expression or artistic freedom, then the transparency obligation also no longer applies. And this latter exception is actually quite interesting, because that means that under current law, AI-generated art does not need to disclose its artificially generated nature, which is a hot topic in current copyright literature, because under copyright, AI-generated art cannot enjoy copyright protection, whereas human-generated art can, but it is again hard to detect or hard to distinguish one from the other. Other relevant EU initiatives with regards to deepfakes are the 2018 Action Plan Against Disinformation, which was complemented by a code of practice on disinformation. This was agreed upon by stakeholders and includes, for instance, a self-reporting transparency duty on a variety of actors or stakeholders in these fields. And this code of practice was actually strengthened in 2022 by including additional obligations on the stakeholders in this context. Now we will turn again to Frederic, who will discuss several US initiatives.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. So the US, the recent experience of election interference might explain, at least in part, why the United States appears to be at the forefront of legislative attempts to regulate deepfake technology. At the federal level, there have been proposals to regulate deepfakes, but none of the initiatives there have been turned into legislation. In the Senate in Washington, the Deepfake Task Force Act is currently on the table. This act aims to assist the Department of Homeland Security in its mission to counter deepfake technology. The legislation would create a task force charged with producing a coordinated plan to explore how a digital content provenance standard could assist with reducing the spread of deepfakes. It also has to develop tools for content creators to authenticate their content and its origin. And it should increase the ability of civil society and industry leaders to relay trust and information about the source of the deepfakes to consumers. So the task force would be comprised of experts from academia, government, civil society, and industry. Then at the state level, legislation has already been enacted. We briefly go over it here. In Texas, in 2019, Texas was the first state to enact legislation to address the problem of deepfakes being used to influence voting in elections for public office. It criminalizes the creation and publication of material that is intended to influence the outcome within 30 days of an election. And the offender there has to have the intention to injure a candidate or influence the result of an election. Then in the same year in Virginia, the state added an amendment to an already existing law that regulates crimes involving morals and decency. The law or the amendment, the law criminalizes, among other things, unlawful dissemination or sale of images of another. And the amendment appended the broadly encompassing term falsely created videographic or still image. Then in California, in 2020, the state of California enacted a bill prohibiting the generation or the dissemination of pornographic deepfakes. It has a statute of limitations for 3 years and is accompanied by a separate clause covering political deepfakes. Then one of the most recent ones is the one of New York. In 2021, New York introduced a bill which not only outlaws the creation and/or the republishing of pornographic deepfakes, but it actively protects a user's right of publicity in regard to a computer-generated likeness through deepfakes, the CGI technology, or any other means, even after death, if the person in question was a resident of New York at the time of their death. And lastly, Maryland has amended its laws around child pornography to encompass and criminalize the use of deepfakes. Then the last initiative we will look at is the initiatives taken in the UK. You can go to the next slide, Thomas. In the UK, there's currently the online safety bill. That is the government's commitment to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online while defending free expression. The aim of the online bill is to introduce rules to social media and other user-generated content-based sites that compel them to remove illegal material from their platforms, with a particular emphasis on protecting children from harmful content. In addition, the largest platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter will have to tackle forms of legal but harmful content, which could include issues such as promoting self-harm or eating disorders. So one of the proposals in the text states that the companies that fail to comply risk a fine up to 10% of turnover or up to £18 million. So first draft of this bill, this very ambitious bill, has been published in May last year, but it received a lot of criticism. The bill vote has been delayed now this year due to the appointment of a new government in the UK. So it remains to be seen what the final draft will look like. Then this summer, the Law Commission of England and Wales published a report in which it had a number of recommendations to bring current laws in line with the smartphone age, to ensure that it is easier to prosecute those who take or share sexual, nude, or other intimate images of people without their consent. One of the proposals of the Law Commission entails that sharing deepfake pornography without consent should be punishable by prison sentences of up to 3 years. I will now give the floor again to Thomas, who will talk about the Google initiative.
Yes, so and then a final interesting, quite recent initiative as well is actually a measure taken by a platform, namely Google, because Google offers the collaborative platform called Google Colab, and through an update of its terms of use, it actually included deepfakes in the list of disallowed projects, meaning that you, in principle, can no longer train deepfakes on its Colab platform. And this was discovered by the fact that an open source deepfake generator called Deepfake was no longer available, and that it was no longer possible to run that on Google Colab. However, enforcement of that new rule appears to be blacklist based. So a specific project has really to be mentioned in a certain list, because apparently not all code triggers that warning or makes it unavailable. And for instance, another project called Face Swap was still available at the time of writing. This was also explicitly confirmed by a Google spokesperson that they will uphold their Google's AI principles, and that banning deepfakes is part of that. Now, finally, and to conclude this part a bit, we thought it was also relevant to actually give a bit of an overview of other and general legal principles that may have an influence on deepfakes, because actually a variety of legal regimes or existing rules may enter into this picture, or let's say battlefield, depending on your stance. And so, for instance, general civil contract law may come into play if deepfakes are used to wrongfully induce someone to enter into a contract, because in such situation, the relevant contractual consent becomes vitiated due to fraud, mistake, or even undue influences, and that renders a subsequent contract invalid or void. Similarly, the use of deepfakes may also be punishable under a variety of existing offenses under Belgian criminal law. Think about extortion, fraud, IT fraud, deception, abuse of trust, IT sabotage, IT forgery, and so on. Moreover, the more recent offenses of voyeurism and the non-consensual dissemination of nude and sexual images may also come into play. Additionally, pornographic content related to children is always prohibited, regardless of its possible artificial nature, just as extreme pornographic material is. However, and just as in any other situation which involves criminal law, the context and the intention of the perpetrator will matter, meaning that no general statements with regards to criminal law can be made in this regard. Then a third interesting or relevant regime are the personal images rights, and this also ties into a question that was already raised with regard to Disney and the likeness of Carrie Fisher or other actors, because in the EU, these personal image rights, they protect your image and voice, and they can only be used by you if you by others if you provide your consent. Now, those rights are limited, however, because it only applies until 20 years after the death of a person. It only protects recognizable images, and public figures, they need to accept certain curtailments of that rights due to their public role. This also ties in, by the way, with the question on IP, because as said, create a deep fake can be protected under, for instance, copyright, but that's then in the hypothesis of an entirely new generated deepfake. But suppose that you adapt a scene from an existing movie, then in principle, the copyright to that existing movie still applies. And so you cannot just adapt existing scenes out of movies without actually obtaining consent of the relevant copyright holders. Now, the GDPR may also come into play, especially if personal data is used, for instance, to train deepfakes or to produce deepfakes, because in that instance, then the variety of obligations under the GDPR have to be complied with. Think about an appropriate legal basis. Now, the limit to the protection of the GDPR is that the GDPR protection only applies with regard to living persons. So once a person is deceased, it is no longer protected by those rules. And finally, other restraints may also come from the extensive rules on unfair commercial practices or misleading advertisements. Think about the use of a deepfake of a famous person in order to promote a certain product, which may give the wrongful impression on consumers that the famous person supports such products, and such practice may actually be prohibited under the misleading advertisements law. And so this list was just to illustrate that deepfakes do definitely not operate in a legal vacuum, and that there are actually quite a bit of possibly relevant rules. And now, as a matter of concluding this webinar, we try to show you that there are actually quite a bit of ongoing policy initiatives with different focuses or approaches, but that they generally try to tackle the threats and general challenges which were mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation. And now a common concern or a recurring theme in those initiatives are that the rules that there are already legal rules, but that the detection of deepfakes on the one hand is hard, but also enforcing those existing rules. So we should definitely keep investing in deepfake detection, while at the same time there is also definitely a need for increased societal awareness of the impact of deepfakes. So we need to keep investing in increasing digital literacy. Now, should you wish more information on the policy initiatives discussed, you can definitely go and check out the Policy Monitor on our website, which entails larger summaries of those initiatives. And later we will also publish a blog on this webinar along with the slides used. So now we can turn towards the Q&A. I think I already covered a few of the questions, but I remember that there were questions with regard to the part of Lucas. So maybe those questions can be covered first.
Yes, I will quickly run through the Q&A because we ran a bit over time. There was one question for Lucas, a question of Catherine. Lucas, you mentioned during your talk that you used explainable AI techniques to detect deepfakes. Could you briefly explain how the technique works?
Yeah, so explainable AI is just a concept that's encompasses various techniques to explain what machine learning is actually doing or what it's basing its prediction on. So what you saw was, as I mentioned, to detect the deepfakes, what they do is they just convert the video into frames, and then they do a classifier, basically an image classifier on each individual image, and then give a score whether or not it is a deepfake or not. And so the explainable part, what it does is it just looks at when you feed the image into the machine learning network, then you're gonna look where the attention of the machine learning model was pointed to, which you can deduct from the weights and like the calculations that you get out of it. And that's basically the red zones where the focus areas were of the machine learning for making the prediction of that single image. I hope that explains it a little bit.
Yes, thank you. There was another question about the consequences in terms of IP and copyrights.
I already tried to tackle that.
Maybe another one about detection, also for Lucas. Question by Sophie. Apart from the resources problem of social media platforms, is it technically possible to detect what parts in a video have been tampered with, for instance in court, when a video has been submitted as evidence?
So the problem here is that it's very, very hard to definitively give statements. We're in the realm of probabilities here, right? We can feed it to an algorithm and then get a probability back of what that model thinks if it's tampered with or not. But yeah, in order to really be able to use it in a court case, I guess we'll have to resort to metadata. We'll have to prove the authenticity, be able to prove the authenticity of a video in order to be able to say that, yeah, it has not been tampered with.
Thank you. Maybe one last question in the Q&A is about the role of journalists and fact checkers. Thomas, can you maybe go into that?
Yes, indeed. I think that's a very relevant question, because journalists and fact checkers, they are definitely one of the stakeholders that should assist, for instance, technology providers in developing detection tools, because they used already their, let's say that they have already their existing practices with regard to the detection of deepfakes, fake news. And so maybe there can definitely be a good crossover and sharing of practices in that regard. This was also mentioned by the Austrian action plan, actually.
Okay, thank you. So hereby, I think we should wrap up since we are already over time. I would like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. The slides and the recording will be published on our website tomorrow. Have a nice day and see you next time.